Hello, everybody. It's an honor to be here. I want to thank Stefan and the ILSI team for all their kind accommodations. Um, I'm going to focus a little bit on, well, primarily on nutrition, as was noted. And my my history in this area has really been around attempts to try and integrate nutrition into this conversation. Most of the focus of the work and the attention that's been given to the impact of climate and the changing environment has been on food systems, supply side issues, and exposures. As we've just heard eloquently presented, the exposure scenarios are complicated and compelling. But nutrition plays a role here, and I'm going to hopefully make a case for that. Next slide. I have nothing to disclose other than my frustration and my fiscal limitations and inability to join you guys in beautiful Florida. Next slide. So just to go through a little bit of a philosophical approach to the work that we've been doing, I should back up by saying, as noted, I've recently joined the Office of Nutrition Research at NIH after 24 years at the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development as a program director for nutrition. I'm now at ONR, and I want to acknowledge that the opportunities that provides, and I want to acknowledge the leadership of the new director of the Office of Nutrition Research, Dr. Andrew Bremer. Drew and I have been working together for 6 years, and a lot of what will be presented today have been concepts and approaches that we've been developing over the course of our working relationship. So the first underlying sort of philosophical concept is the appreciation of the need for a balance between research, basic biomedical research, and translational activities. This is really a critical piece. I think going back 20 years or so, NIH has tried to move in the direction of supporting translational sciences, recognizing that it's one thing to develop the science, it's another thing to take that science and apply it in a meaningful way. Next slide. This is just a definition that sort of codifies the importance of translational science. This comes from the National Center of Application of Translational Science. And it really, the key piece here is the recognition that there's a spectrum of activity in translational science that needs to be recognized. And this spectrum does represent a continuum, and it's not one piece, it's really a continuum. Next slide. This cartoon just reflects that continuum. In the context of nutrition science, we have basic nutrition science research to understanding the biology of nutrition as a biological variable, its role in health and well-being. Then taking that information and applying it to the development of assessment and interventions, the implementation of those interventions, and the engagement of the enabling community that's needed to provide the resources, build capacity, et cetera. And this is a continuous feedback loop. I will also say that much of what you're going to hear today is based on my focus over the course of my career on nutritional assessment and the importance of nutritional assessment. The core question being, what's different about a given individual or population that would require something other than the provision of a safe, well-balanced diet? And how do we know that? How do we understand the needs of individuals and populations? Next slide. So a few slides about the global context, sort of a statement of the problem. Next slide. This is a bit of a complicated slide, but I think you get the gist of it. That top line, undernutrition, the nutrition transition, and multiple burdens of nutrition is sort of a conventional view of nutrition, and the focus of much of what has been done historically, both in the US and globally, has been focused on addressing those issues. But I would like to make the case here that nutrition is more than just exposure scenarios, more than just too much or too little food or nutrients. And that while that issue of malnutrition broadly continues to be a challenge, it's occurring at the same time as increased pandemic diseases, whether it's HIV, TB, malaria, COVID, or what we just discussed with regard to food safety, vector-borne diseases, et cetera. And of course, the increasing prevalence of non-communicable diseases. All of those are occurring at the same time. And you'll note that all those arrows go in both directions, because really there is a reciprocal relationship here between all of these things. They affect and are affected by each other. That bit in the middle is just an acknowledgement that both in terms of assessment and functional implications of these conditions, inflammation and the microbiome are playing an increasingly important role, and our understanding of those two critical aspects of human biology are really a major motivation on a lot of new research. At the bottom, there's a recognition that all this is occurring over the life course. There's a recognition there of the so-called DOHAD hypothesis, early life exposures leading to later life challenges. But this is a really important component of this. It is occurring over the life course. Next slide, please. The complexity is manifested in many ways, and this is just one example. This comes from WHO, and it really shows the complexity of the scenarios that are associated with the diseases that are really global health challenges. In this case, it's diarrheal disease. You can see that there's multiple pathways for getting diarrheal diseases, including the issues around water safety and food safety, et cetera. The point that I'd like to make there is that all those interactions and pathways are really critically important. But what's really important, at least from my point of view, and it's underappreciated, is the role of vulnerability of the populations that we're looking at. And that vulnerability certainly is contributed to by malnutrition in all of its forms, as well as life course. So that issue of who gets sick and why, at what stage of their life course and in what context, nutrition has to play and does play a really important role in that vulnerability. Next slide, please. Next. So what sort of responses, what's in our toolkit from a global perspective and in the United States? So in the United States, of course, we have dietary guidance, the dietary guidelines for Americans that is a renewable process every 5 years to address the role of diet and health. There's global nutrition targets set up by WHO that we're trying to achieve and struggling with. And there's the sustainability development goals, in particular developmental SDG number 2, which really focuses on hunger and food systems. All those things we're struggling to meet them. We're struggling to address them. Next slide. And here's just one example of the struggles that we're having. Here's some data that comes from FAO, noting the prevalence of hunger, which of course is not limited to malnutrition. Hunger is the limitation of food and calories. It doesn't really address all forms of malnutrition. And just to be clear, if we were to eliminate hunger in the world, we would not be eliminating malnutrition. And we need to recognize the importance of malnutrition as part of the scenario. And there's some data there that indicates some aspects of the malnutrition scenario. If you want more information about this, FAO has provided a couple of websites that you can go to get some updated information. Next slide, please. So what does this all mean? In the current world scenario, we are making some progress. I don't want to be negative about all things. I'm often accused of that, given my role in trying to make the case for nutrition. It's, I often focus on what we're not doing, but the fact is we are doing a lot and we are making some progress. We are making some progress with regard to these global targets like stunting and wasting and even iron deficiency. But these are all multiple, very complex, multidimensional conditions that require an approach that's more expansive than just measuring too much or too little food in a dietary scenario. This last piece is just a recognition of the complexity of this. Malnutrition comes in multiple forms. It's often colliding with, communicable infectious diseases as well as non-communicable diseases. And we need to we're just starting to recognize the importance of this collision in our understanding of things like the so-called dual burden or triple burden of malnutrition. Next slide. All this is happening against the perfect storm. This slide just reflects the what's happening in the world. The population is growing, demand is growing, the demands on the food systems are growing, and we have the obvious and clear implications of a changing environment on all of that. Next slide. So how does this affect at the core? What we're talking about here is choices. How does all this affect our ability to make decisions about diet and health? There's a number of decisions that we have to make from a public health point of view in the context of the current armamentarium with regard to interventions. Is it dietary diversity is the best solution? Is it dietary supplements? Is it food fortification? What is it? And how do you make that decision in a given context? The impact of climate on all of these decision-making processes is becoming more and more clear. How do we avoid unintended consequences? There's a myriad of examples of unintended consequences with regard to interventions, irrespective of the impact of climate. But now we have climate that's causing increasing this complexity. Next slide. I guess the bottom line there from that slide is context matters, and the one-size-fits-all approach is just not going to get us where we want to go. So the next series of slides is going to describe a conceptual framework that we've been working on, and it's referred to as the nutrition ecology, recognizing that humans are complex biological systems. They interact with their internal, biological, genetic, nutritional status, et cetera, environment, as well as an external environment. And when we talk about the environment, this cartoon just represents what environment represents. It's a holistic view of the environment. It's not just the physical environment. It's a social, demographic, geopolitical, and human health environment. Next slide. A key driver with regard to decisions about diet and health is the implications of nutrition and food security. Nutrition and food security represent their own sort of ecology, and they're impacted by multiple factors, as highlighted in this cartoon. Again, you note that the arrows go both ways. There's a continual reciprocal relationship and impact of the human impact, the social, demographic environment, et cetera. Next slide. And of course, we've talked about, I understand you've been talking quite a bit about at the meeting, the food system. This is just a reflection of that particular ecology. And from our point of view and the work that we've been doing, we recognize the comprehensiveness of the food system. At the bottom there is a definition. There's a pretty good working definition of food systems, recognizing everything from seed to table and all of the aspects of the food production system, and marketing, consumer choice, et cetera. So this is just intended to reflect that complexity. Next slide, please. When we talk about the food system, there's often a tendency to look at this as a one-directional relationship. That is the impact of our choices on the food system. A lot of what we've heard about, whether it's the role of animal source foods and sustainable agricultural practices, the focus tends to be on the impact of the food system on the environment. But obviously, the environment is having a significant impact on the food system. Both in terms of the delivery of nutrients as well as the amount of food that is being produced. There's a whole array of things that are going on in this reciprocal relationship. And we heard a brief discussion in the previous presentation about this temporal relationship. We do have to understand that climate change is a sort of a generic term that people sort of use, but what we're really talking about is a range of temporal influences on the climate, which is a long-term proposition. But there's also the impact of short-term disasters, and all of that is having an impact on this reciprocal relationships. Next slide. So bringing this all back to nutrition, this cartoon is just intended to reflect the role of nutrition here. Nutrition really is the glue that ties our understanding of climate, environmental change, its impact on food systems, and health. Nutrition really is the glue that fits in the middle there. It's not just a matter of exposure affecting health. The mechanism for doing that is through nutrition, the role of nutrition as a biological variable, as an input and an outcome of health and disease, and an integral and inextricable factor in any biological system we want to look at. Nutrition plays a role in all aspects of human biology and needs to be recognized as such in this relationship. Next slide, please. So when you put this all together, this is just a cartoon to reflect this complexity and the importance of studying and controlling these sources of variability in our study of nutrition, this nutrition ecology. So it does really reflect the biology, the environment, the internal environment, the external environment, and all of those factors that are involved in both. And how we understand that is the challenge. How do we put that all together in an analytical framework that is useful and that can be then translated into meaningful programs and policies, is the challenge. Next slide. So we've had a number of projects. I'm not going to go into all the other projects that we've done. We've applied this ecological model to a number of areas. We've recently published a series of papers focused on infant feeding human milk biology. And human milk is a biological system that's called the BEGIN Project. It's a series in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition if you're interested. But it applies that ecological approach, understanding human milk is a biological system that's impacted by an internal biology coming from both the parent and the infant, and all of which is influenced by an external environment. We've also, we're in the process of completing a project looking at how we assess the impact, the need for and impact of interventions to address nutrition in school-age children. There's a huge global enterprise around school meals and support of school-age children. And they're doing a pretty good job. Of course, COVID hit it hard. That shut it all down. And in their efforts to pull that, get it back up to the exposure level that it was pre-pandemic, one of the things that became clear is that while there's a tremendous enterprise for developing these programs and rolling out these programs, there's no consensus for how to measure the impact of this program. This gets to this issue of assessment that I talked about earlier. How do you assess the need for an impact of an intervention like school meals on growth and development of school-age children? So that project is called the Bond Kids Project. It's built on the Bond Project, which some of you may be familiar with, which is really focused on the discovery, development, and deployment of nutritional assessment methodologies. We applied the Bond Project platform to this issue of school-age children assessing impact. But the project I'm going to talk about now is directly related to our topic of concern here. And it is really, the project is called Agriculture and Diet Value Added for Nutrition Translation and Adaptation in the Global Ecology, the Advantage Project. Next slide. The motives for the Advantage Project is really to explore the evidence that supports the contention that climate is having an impact on our ability to make decisions about interventions, and particularly dietary guidance. The hope is that the project will inform those that are making dietary guidelines, those that are developing interventions, all of the interventions that I touched on earlier, whether it's food fortification, dietary supplements, et cetera, all being impacted by climate. What are the things that you need to consider, and how can we help inform that process? To be clear, this project, while it does, have a focus on dietary guidelines, is not officially affiliated with the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. Hopefully it will inform that process, but it really is intended to be supportive. Next slide, please. So the core questions with regard that we're trying to address here is that if we accept the premise that there are three buckets of information that are used in the development of intervention strategies, including dietary guidelines, those three buckets being, diet and health relationships, specific health priorities, whether it's diabetes or infectious disease, non-communicable disease, other non-communicable diseases, obesity, the period of the 1,000 days, pregnancy and first 2 years of life, whatever the case may be. What is the relationship of diet and health? The next bucket would be what people eat, why. It's not just what they eat, but why do they make those decisions, and how do we understand that relationship? And the third one is the food system and the capacity of the food system to meet the needs of target populations. So the core questions would be, is climate affecting those three buckets? If it is affecting those three buckets, how do we develop an analytical framework to analyze that? And then how do we take that information and translate it into a way that's usable to those people that are making decisions and the broader community? Next slide. Next couple of slides will just be a quick overview of the process. This is how we've divided the project using an ecological approach. We have 5 working groups. The first 3 working groups are in the Venn diagram. There's one focused on diet and health relationships in the intersection with climate. The second one is focused on food patterns, dietary patterns, and the third is focused on food systems. The fourth group is focused on this really challenging question of how do you take this very complex multiple systems and multiple measures and metrics, and how do you develop an analytical framework that would be useful to address this issue? One of the issues that we'd like to be able to address, and we can talk about a little bit later, is how do we integrate a consideration of a changing environment into things like NIH? NIH currently doesn't consider a changing environment, despite the fact that in those regions, 5 regions that the NIH is divided into, they all have very different climate scenarios. And depending on when you're collecting the data, there can be all sorts of things, from wildfires to droughts to severe storms to all sorts of things going on at the time of collection. We're not accounting for that. We're not in any way at this point. Similarly, there are agencies like the EPA that are looking at the relationship between climate and things like child health. Those efforts are not including a consideration of food and nutrition. So how do we put that all together in a meaningful way is a challenge that we're all faced with. And so that's part of what Working Group 4 will be doing. And then Working Group 5 is a recognition that, data is evolving. Our understanding of these complex relationships are evolving. How do we take this complex systems interactions and complex data sets that are evolving and translate them in a way that's useful to the community, not just those that are making decisions, but consumers? We're inundated with a lot of information. What are the things that we need to consider to support the development of context-specific, equitable programs, policies, and interventions? So that's the challenge of Working Group 5. And of course, this is all over the course of time and a live course presentation perspective. Next slide. This is just a quick listing of the working groups. So each of the working groups have co-chairs. These are the co-chairs. We're very fortunate to have a tremendously knowledgeable cadre of folks helping us out here. And you can see some of those names, many of which are recognizable to you. They've been working hard and developing their individual reports. Next slide. Working Group 1, this is just a cartoon to represent, sort of some of the things that are going on. Here's a cartoon that represents the kind of things that Working Group 1 is dealing with, this intersection of climate, diet, and these specific health outcomes of interest to develop a perspective on the health context. Next slide. Well, Working Group 2 is focusing on dietary patterns, and they've developed a perspective on how to look at dietary patterns and the things that are influencing choice, whether it's purchasing, the effect of climate on purchasing issues, preparation issues, dietary pattern issues, and waste and issues of that sort, and food safety. So those are all the buckets that are being addressed by that Working Group 2 and their efforts to address this intersection of diet and dietary patterns. Next. This is Working Group 3. We'll be focusing on that reciprocal relationship of food systems, and this is the cartoon I showed before. This is just reflecting that ecology, the food system ecology that they'll be covering. Next slide. I should say that Working Group 3 will be focusing on the food system from both the producer perspective as well as the consumer perspective, the impact on the food system and the food system's ability to meet needs, as well as the factors that are going to influence production choices, et cetera. This is, just a quick overview of what's next. We're going to publish all these papers. We're going to continue to work in this area. We are hopeful to have a phase 2, which will work with multiple agencies and stakeholders to see how we can take some of this new information and move it forward. I provide a website there if you're interested in looking at the Advantage project. Next slide. I think that's it. Thank you.
Hi, Dan. This is Connie Weaver from San
What's
Diego
up,
State.
Connie?
I appreciated you talking about Bond Kids since I worked with you for a couple of years
Absolutely.
on that. So this last project made me wonder. You said NIH could maybe ask some questions to see what was going on with climate change. But the way it's sampled with the different geographical regions, could you really sort what would happen with a disaster versus, I mean, I don't even remember seeing papers on what's the natural intake distribution because of the region of sampling, south versus north or whatever. And you'd have to overcome that variation to see if there was a climate change effect.
Well, there's a couple of ways we can go about doing this. You all know what the challenges are to add anything to NIH. Everything comes with a dollar cost, and they're already strapped. And so to ask them to add something else to the survey means probably you're going to take something else out. There's all the challenges of validating a questionnaire, et cetera, et cetera. So there's that. It's not impossible. I think that there are conversations that are ongoing. There's a willingness to take a look at that. But one of the things that we can consider doing is the global Climate Research Program, GCRP, is a congressionally mandated program for the U.S. government. And there is a data repository from the multiple agencies, NOAA, EPA, et cetera, that are looking at the impact of the climate, both in real time, down to a narrow regional geographic location. They have data on all of that. And one of the things we can consider is figuring out how we can use that data and make it available to the user community, the community represented here at ILSI, the academic community. How can we make those data available so that we can superimpose it on the data that we are collecting with regard to diet and health and see if we can get some of those answers. So there's a number of ways we can go about looking at this. And we're at the beginning of these conversations, but there are a number of opportunities within the U.S. government to coordinate these activities, and we're working to make that happen. Thanks, Connie.
So we heard a talk earlier on machine learning. It sounds like that's how you would integrate that.
That's obviously a part of it. We've got all the opportunities that AI presents. We're in a new world in terms of complex data systems. And, I'm learning a lot just from working with that working group 4 on the analytics piece of it. That's one of the chairs is Bruce Lee, who is, just world-class in terms of understanding how to develop a systems approach to these complex data sets.
Hi, Dan. This is Umon from Thailand.
Wow. Hi, Mort.
Hi. Lovely to hear what you are after. After the bond, you have been going with a lot more on how to make sense out of much of the data. Now, I'm struck by what you said about context matters, and there's no one size fit all, and that the low middle income countries are the hardest hit. And in all fronts, they are really at the bottom of the pit. How do you see the framework of Advantage, primarily, which I think has a lot of implication to those down there? Can that give some hope as to how they probably have to start asking what to do first. Everything seems to come up as a priority because it's such a worsened situation and things are getting worse. So priority issue of how do you see priority and how to get to the solution that fits that situation? Is there lots of some of the things that could be translated from the Advantage project to help those low middle income countries?
Well, you're spot on as always, Maureen, and that is part of our discussion of the Advantage project is, how do you apply this new knowledge to different settings? And obviously the low middle income settings are getting hammered, mostly through no fault of their own. And I think, one of the things, as you recall, with regard to the bond project is really to recognize that there are different users for these data. And so we need to make the data and these analytical frameworks available and accessible to everybody throughout the system. At one level, we certainly need to do a better job with regard to integrating multiple systems within a given country. So whether it's the ag system, the economics department, the health system, et cetera, they need to be talking to each other. We need, in terms of nutrition and understanding nutrition, we need to increase the cadre of professionals that are doing this work, that are actually, the boots on the ground, meeting with people and collecting data and making treatment plans. We work closely with the Academy for Nutrition and Dietetics. The dietetic community needs to be better integrated into this process. We've seen a movement towards increasing the attention of nutrition to the medical community, which is clearly important because, as we've been saying for years and years, there's no medical nutrition in medical training. But the fact of the matter is, someone was sharing this with me just recently, that in the U.S., there's medical doctors only have less than 10 minutes to meet with a patient, and they go through their paradigm for identifying problems. Usually doesn't include nutrition unless there's a specific identified need like diabetes, then they'll tend to it. But it's not part of their checklist. So are we looking to add something else for them to do in that 8 minutes, or do we need access to a cadre of folks that can work more closely with the medical community? And this I think the same goes in the low resource settings. And if you're a primary care setting in a village somewhere, you need to have the support and the technical support of someone that can ask the right questions. I think that we can pull this together. There's lots of new technology out there, whether it's mHealth, mobile phones and things of that sort, to collect data, pull these things together. I think those are all on the horizon. We have lots of tools that are emerging for our disposal, but you're absolutely right. We need to do a better job of attending to this complexity in those contexts. Thank you, everyone.